The fluorescent lights above Oak Creek Memorial's ICU hum like insects trapped in glass. Hannah Clarke walks through the automatic doors at 6:38 a.m., her scrubs loose enough to hide the scars that ladder up her forearms, her gait compensating for a left knee that aches before thunderstorms. She's been coming through these doors for 8 months now, and nobody here knows that her 20s were spent in Baghdad, that her family believes she did relief work overseas, that she still checks sight lines in every room without thinking. The smell hits her first, antiseptic mixing with floor wax and something underneath, something like fear that never quite washes out of a hospital. She moves past the nurses' station where 3 staff members are already gathered around the assignment board, their voices low. The ICU is running at full capacity. For ventilators humming their mechanical rhythm. 2 critical admissions overnight. 1 unexpected transfer to surgery. Hannah absorbs this information the way she's always absorbed information, completely, instantly, without appearing to be listening. Her locker hangs in the break room, 3rd column from the door. She opens it and the jacket falls forward, the one she's worn through every shift since arriving in Raleigh. Inside the lining, barely visible even if someone looked, is the faded unit patch from her time with JSOC. Desert tan. Ghost insignia. The stitching is worn from a decade of being touched like a talisman, the way soldiers touch lucky charms before raids. She pushes the jacket aside and pulls on her 2nd scrub top, the movement efficient and practiced. By 7:15 a.m., Hannah is standing at the bedside of room 4, where a 58-year-old construction worker named Marcus is recovering from emergency appendectomy. His abdomen is distended. His oxygen saturation is dropping. Most nurses would call the resident. Hannah is already running her assessment, her fingers positioned at the 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, checking for tension pneumothorax before even listening to breath sounds. The subtle give of air under pressure. The way his breathing changes when she checks the other side. She's already moving toward the med cart when Dr. Sterling appears. He's tall enough to make doorways seem smaller. 46 years old, inherited family money from Boston real estate, married to a woman who hasn't spoken to him in 3 years but hasn't filed for divorce either because the arrangement suits them both. He wears Italian shoes that cost more than Hannah's monthly rent and a watch that keeps better time than the hospital clocks. His hair is the color of old money and his voice carries the kind of authority that comes from never being told no. Dr. Sterling stops beside Marcus's bed, clipboard in hand. He looks at the chart. He looks at Hannah. Interesting technique, Clarke, he says. His voice is loud enough for the 2 nurses in the doorway to hear. Did you learn that on YouTube? Hannah takes one measured breath. She meets his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, not defiant, not submissive, just present, then looks down at her hands. They are steady. They're always steady. It works, she says quietly, and returns to her charting. She can feel him waiting for more. Waiting for defensiveness. Waiting for explanation or deference or the small crack that would give him leverage. She gives him nothing. The silence stretches for 4 seconds. Then he turns and moves to the next room, his shoes making soft sounds against the polished floor. But something has shifted. She can feel it the way animals feel shifts in barometric pressure. She has just made herself visible. Hannah grew up in Phoenix. Her father was an insurance adjuster. Her mother taught 2nd grade. They wanted her to be a teacher too, or a therapist, something stable and civilian and rooted to one place. Instead, she enlisted at 18, and for 12 years she was something else entirely, something classified and compartmentalized and necessary. She worked trauma response for JSOC operations in Baghdad, Fallujah, Sanjin Valley. She had a call sign that nobody uses anymore. She had hands that had held together more broken bodies than Dr. Sterling had seen in his entire career. Then came the night in Kandahar when she pulled a staff sergeant out of a burning Humvee and his left leg was already gone and his right leg was half gone and he was still screaming her name. That was 7 years ago. After that, the nightmares didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. So she walked away. Her parents don't know. They think she's been working disaster relief for international non-profits, a story that explains the PTSD, the way she still wakes up reaching for gear that isn't there, the way she sometimes forgets she's not in a combat zone. Her sister thinks she's been in Ecuador and Nepal and the Democratic Republic of Congo. None of that is true. She's been in Raleigh for 8 months, working night shift ICU, reading psychology textbooks at 3 a.m., learning how to be a person who exists in the daylight. Learning how to exist in a place where the worst thing that happens is usually written in a chart and not written in scars across a human body. The morning rounds continue. Hannah moves with invisible efficiency through 11 patient rooms, checking lines and vitals and the small signs that mean something is about to break. She's the kind of nurse who knows what's about to happen before the monitors do. The kind who has learned to read the body's grammar before it starts shouting. She catches the ICU charge nurse, Jennifer, near the med cart around 8:30. "How's your morning?" Jennifer asks. She's a good nurse. Genuinely good. The kind who asked Hannah about her background during orientation and seemed satisfied when Hannah said relief work without elaborating. "Busy," Hannah says. "Room for is going to need a CT, possible perforation. I can call it down if you want." Jennifer glances at the chart. Most nurses would have called the resident and waited for orders. Hannah's assessment is usually right. "Yeah, make the call," she says. By 10 a.m., Hannah has been right twice. She's caught an early septic spike in room 8 and prevented a patient in room 2 from pulling out a central line by moving the 4-pole to the other side of the bed, where his restless hand couldn't reach it. She hasn't spoken to Dr. Sterling again. She's been aware of him every second. The break room smells like stale coffee and the cheese someone heated in the microwave 2 hours ago. Hannah is sitting alone, scrolling through her phone when the unit board is updated. Room assignments for the next shift. New admissions. And then, posted prominently in red marker across the whiteboard where everyone sees it during shift change. Hannah Clarke, unauthorized procedures written up, contact Dr. Sterling for performance review. The words are still wet. The marker smells sharp. She stares at it for 3 seconds. Her jaw clamps. Her breathing stays level. She doesn't tremble. She doesn't burn red. She doesn't retreat to cry in the supply closet like a civilian would. Instead, she closes her eyes and touches the lining of her jacket where the unit patch rests against her ribs, and she reminds herself what it feels like to be the kind of person who survives. The room is silent except for the fluorescent lights buzzing their electric song. She takes another breath. Then another. And then the real nightmare began. The bulletin board outside the break room had Hannah's name on it before she arrived for her shift. Red marker. Not pen. Red, like blood, like warning. Hannah Clarke, unauthorized procedures during trauma assessment, failure to follow attending physician directives. Protocol violations. Under review. The notice was posted during shift change. Every nurse on Oak Creek Memorial's trauma floor would see it. By noon, they had. She stood in front of it for exactly 4 seconds, reading her own name like it belonged to someone else. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum above her head. Someone had written a small smiley face next to Dr. Sterling's signature. She didn't look to see who. The nickname started the next day. "Here comes YouTube," Dr. Sterling announced when Hannah entered the supply room on day 2, his voice bright and theatrical, like he was introducing a game show contestant. 2 residents laughed, the kind of laugh that only happens when someone with institutional power gives permission. Hannah was reaching for sterile gauze. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge him. She selected what she needed, counted the packages with methodical precision, and left the room. But she heard the laughter follow her into the hallway like smoke. YouTube. As in, unauthorized videos. As in, self-taught. As in, not a real doctor. The diminishment was complete. By the end of the first week, the break room had become a study in negative space. Hannah would sit at the corner table, the one nearest the window that overlooked the parking lot and the rain-slicked streets beyond, and eat her lunch without tasting it. 30 seconds would pass. Then a nurse would stand, gathering her half-eaten sandwich, her yogurt, her thermos of coffee that she'd abandoned mid-sip. Sorry, they'd mouth, because apologies were easier than explanations. Within 3 minutes, the room would be empty except for the fluorescent lights and Hannah and the ghost of her reputation. She stopped coming to the break room after the 4th day. Started eating at her desk instead, during the quiet hours between midnight and 2 in the morning, when most of the hospital was sleeping and she could be alone with the sound of ventilators and the soft beep of monitors that marked the rhythm of other people's lives. Dr. Sterling would pass her station sometimes, his badge catching the light of the computer screens. He'd pause, long enough for her to feel him there, long enough for the moment to stretch into something uncomfortable. Then he'd move on, and she'd hear him in other rooms, his voice effortlessly authoritative, the kind of voice that made people trust him the way they stopped trusting her. But the real humiliation came during a family conference on a Tuesday afternoon. The patient was a motorcyclist, 32 years old, high-speed impact with a cement barrier on I-40 near Beltline. He had a pneumothorax, a displaced rib fracture, abdominal contusions. Hannah had been monitoring him since his arrival, watching his oxygen saturation, checking his breath sounds, noting the subtle changes in his respiratory pattern that told her his lungs were working harder than they should have been. She documented it all with precision, the kind of precision that came from muscle memory trained into her body over 18 years she couldn't talk about. Dr. Sterling arrived at 1,430 hours to present the case to the family. Hannah was already there, standing at the bedside with her tablet, her vitals report ready. The motorcyclist's wife sat in the plastic chair by the window. Their daughter stood behind her, 8 or 9 years old, holding a stuffed bear that had probably not left her hand since her father was flown in by helicopter. "The patient is stable," Hannah began, her voice the flat, careful voice of a nurse who had learned to be invisible. "Oxygen saturation is 94% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Respiratory rate is elevated at 22, which is normal for trauma with pneumothorax. We're monitoring for tension development." "I'm sorry, let me interrupt." Dr. Sterling's voice cut through hers like a scalpel. He smiled at the family. It was the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring. It wasn't. "Ms. Clarke, can you explain to this family why you performed a needle decompression without consulting the attending physician?" The room went dead silent. The wife's hand tightened on the armrest of her chair. The daughter pulled the stuffed bear closer to her chest. Hannah's jaw clenched. Just a fraction. Just enough to feel like something breaking in her throat. "The patient's oxygen saturation was dropping," she said. Her hands were steady on the tablet. Breath sounds were absent on the left side. Subcutaneous emphysema was. "The patient had a doctor," Sterling interrupted. His voice was still pleasant. That was the worst part. The pleasantness. "You're a nurse, Ms. Clarke. Your job is to follow orders, not to improvise. Not to perform procedures that are outside your scope of practice, regardless of your personal assessment of the situation." The motorcyclist's wife was staring at Hannah now. Frightened. Confused. The kind of look that said she was trying to reconcile the woman her husband's nurse had seemed to be with this person Dr. Sterling was describing. Hannah took one measured breath. She felt it in her chest, felt the pressure behind her eyes that comes before tears. One tear formed at the corner of her right eye. Just one. She wiped it with her thumb without looking away from Dr. Sterling, without breaking eye contact, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing weakness. The tear fell anyway. One clean line down her cheek. Her voice, when she spoke, was different. Lower. Controlled. The voice of someone who had learned to speak in the silence of field hospitals where your hands had to be steadier than your voice. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she said. Sterling's expression shifted. Surprise flickered there, genuine surprise, like he hadn't expected her to speak at all. His smile tightened. Then it hardened into something else entirely. Something like hunger. "I know exactly who you are," he said quietly. The family could barely hear him. "You're a nurse with delusions of competence. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to reassure this family that their husband is safe." Hannah stepped back from the bed. She moved to the corner of the room, the corner where she could see everything but belong to nothing, and she watched Dr. Sterling work his magic on the wife. His voice gentled. His hands moved with choreographed confidence. Within 2 minutes, the woman's hands unclenched. The daughter stopped pulling at the bear. They believed him. The way people always believe doctors. Hannah was already forgotten. That night, she stayed late. Not because her shift required it. Because leaving meant going home to an apartment that had no marks of her life in it, no photographs, no memorabilia, nothing that would tell anyone who had ever lived there. So instead she reorganized supply carts that didn't need organizing. She restocked items that were already full. She cleaned the break room when no one was there to see her clean it, moving silently through the fluorescent-lit space like a ghost haunting the building she'd tried to save. The performance improvement plan came a week later. Posted on her locker, her name, her locker, everyone's business. Performance improvement plan initiated. Hannah Clarke. Insubordination. Unauthorized clinical decisions. Failure to respect chain of command. Effective immediately. She was checking supplies, counting bandage packs, a stupid meditative habit from a life she couldn't name, when Dr. Sterling found her at the nurse's station. The evening shift was ending. Residents were cycling through, checking labs, writing notes. No one was really watching, but everyone was watching. "You're a liability," Sterling said. Not loud. Just to her. "YouTube, I've contacted the board. I'm building a file. By the time I'm done, you won't work in any hospital in this state. You understand that?" Hannah looked at him. Really looked at him. This man with his pressed white coat and his expensive watch and his need to be the smartest person in every room. This man who had seen her hands work and interpreted it as a threat instead of a gift. She nodded once. A single movement. Nothing else. "Good," he said. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the private offices where hospital hierarchy had architecture and weight. Hannah returned to her supplies. One more box to check. One more count to complete. Her hands didn't shake. That wasn't composure, though, that was something else. That was the trembling being restraint instead of fear. The difference between someone breaking and someone waiting. What happened next didn't just change Oak Creek Memorial. What happened next would bring a Black Hawk to the roof and men in tactical gear to the doors and the truth about who Hannah Clarke really was, but that was still hours away, still waiting in the darkness beyond the fluorescent lights, still hidden in the spaces between her measured breaths and the moment when everything she'd buried would finally have to emerge. For now, she finished her inventory. For now, she was just a nurse. For now, that was almost enough to survive. But the clock was running. Somewhere in the building, a patient was about to crash. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, forces were moving. Somewhere in the spaces between seconds, the life she'd constructed was about to shatter like glass. The question was only how far the pieces would fly. The medevac helicopter cut through the Raleigh night at 2,300 hours, rotors hammering the air like distant artillery. Hannah heard it first, the low mechanical thrum that made her spine straighten at the nurse's station, a sound that bypassed her conscious mind and activated something older, something trained. The other nurses didn't react. To them it was just noise. To her, it was a trigger. The trauma alert came through the intercom 3 minutes later. Delta Force Colonel, through and through GSW to the left thorax from Baghdad, sepsis markers climbing, chart flagged high-risk combatant. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Hannah was already moving before the announcement finished, checking the trauma bay sight lines, positioning the equipment, her hands moving through muscle memory so automatic it felt like breathing. The colonel arrived on a stretcher, unconscious, pale as death but still breathing. His uniform was shredded, his left side wrapped in field dressings that had turned dark brown. Two military police in dress uniforms flanked the stretcher like sentries. The transfer report came in clipped military cadence, vitals, medications, timeline, the kind of precision that only came from someone who'd briefed under fire. Dr. Sterling materialized in the trauma bay within seconds, still buttoning his shirt, his hair damp from the shower he'd been interrupted midway through. His face held that particular expression he reserved for officers and administrators, calculated respect layered over barely concealed irritation at being called back at midnight. He moved to the head of the stretcher, establishing command presence, and began issuing orders in his command voice. But Hannah was already reading the patient. Her eyes tracked across the dressings, the pallor, the barely perceptible rise of his chest. The monitor showed a heart rate climbing, 142, 151, 159. The oxygen saturation was dropping. His neck veins were distended like cables pulled taut. She knew this pattern. She'd seen it in the field 100 times. She'd treated it in the dark with nothing but a needle and her hands. The first code alarm came at 0320 hours. The colonel's monitor screamed, and everything in the ICU shifted into that particular kind of controlled chaos that only happens when someone is actively dying in a room full of people who know how to respond. Hannah was already at his bedside when Dr. Sterling arrived from his office, this time fully dressed, his face carved from stone. The vitals were catastrophic. Blood pressure 70/40 and dropping. Heart rate 144. Oxygen saturation 68%. The chest X-ray showed clear lungs, the wound wasn't pulmonary. Something else was killing him. Muffled heart sounds, one of the residents said, stethoscope still around her neck. Hannah didn't need a stethoscope. She could hear it in the monitor, see it in the physiology. The blood pooling in the pericardium, surrounding the heart like a vice, squeezing the chambers until they couldn't fill, couldn't pump, couldn't save his life. Cardiac tamponade, Hannah said. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis delivered with absolute certainty. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. He was already calling it too. Get me cardiothoracic on the phone. Now. We need an emergency pericardiocentesis. He'll be dead in 5 minutes, Hannah interrupted. She wasn't supposed to interrupt. She'd learned that lesson painfully in the past 3 weeks. But the colonel's pressure had just dropped to 65. His O2 sat was at 62%. He was exiting the window. She was already pulling the kit, 14-gauge angiocath needle, ultrasound probe, sterile drape. The movements were so practiced, so ingrained in her nervous system, that they looked almost casual to anyone watching. To anyone with her training, they looked like muscle memory made physical. The cardiothoracic surgeon is 15 minutes out, Dr. Sterling said, and his voice had that particular edge that meant he was exercising authority to prove he still had it. We wait for the specialist. The colonel's pressure dropped to 62. He'll be dead, Hannah said again, and this time her voice had changed. It dropped half an octave. The command present she'd buried for 3 weeks surfaced like a submarine breaching. The words came out the way they had when she was running trauma response for operators who were bleeding out in the sand. Not a suggestion. Not a request. A statement of fact delivered by someone who'd learned to make decisions that kept people breathing. 2 residents stepped back instinctively. They felt it too, the sudden gravity shift, the authority that had nothing to do with rank or title and everything to do with having done this 1,000 times when the alternative was watching someone die. Dr. Sterling moved to block her access to the patient. His hand came up, positioning himself between Hannah and the colonel's chest, his face flushed with something that looked like rage but might have been panic. You are not a physician. You will not perform that procedure. You will step back right now, or I will have security remove you from this ICU. The colonel's blood pressure dropped to 55/30. Hannah made a choice that took less than a heartbeat. She stepped forward instead of back, moving with the kind of fluid precision that came from having done this under fire, moving past Dr. Sterling the way water moves around stone, her body already prepping the subxiphoid side with betadine, her hands already steady as surgical steel. The ultrasound probe found the pericardial sac instantly. The screen showed exactly what she expected: blood accumulated in that space, surrounding the heart, drowning him from the inside. She advanced the needle at a 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder, watching the ultrasound, feeling the subtle shift in resistance as the needle punctured the pericardial membrane. She aspirated. 60 cubic centimeters of blood came back into the syringe. The colonel's pressure spiked immediately. 78/42. The heart rhythm steadied. The oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 74, 82, 88. Normal sinus rhythm. The room filled with the steady beep 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 of a heart that wasn't dying anymore. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed except the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. His eyes fixed on Hannah with something that looked like recognition, the moment he understood that whatever she was, it wasn't just a nurse he could humiliate into compliance. "You just assaulted a patient," he said quietly. "Without physician authorization. Without consent. Security is coming. You're finished at this hospital." Before anyone could respond, before the weight of his threat could even settle, the ICU doors exploded inward. The sound was unmistakable: wood splintering, hinges tearing free, and then the sight that made every medical professional in the room freeze solid. For armed men in civilian clothes, faces covered, weapons raised. Not hospital security. Not anything close. The lead gunman scanned the room, his weapon moving with practiced efficiency, and then he locked on the colonel's bed. Hannah didn't think. Training bypassed decision-making. She moved without conscious volition, her body recognizing the threat and responding the way it had been trained to respond. She grabbed the colonel's gurney and shoved it sideways, driving it behind a steel supply cabinet, putting the massive cabinet between the patient and the shooter in one fluid motion that used every ounce of strength she possessed. The rifle barked twice. The rounds hit the cabinet and fragmented. Shrapnel, jagged chunks of steel and copper, tore across Hannah's right shoulder and down her ribs, the pain white-hot and immediate. She felt the impact, felt the burning tear of the metal through skin and muscle, but she didn't scream. Didn't falter. Her left hand stayed locked on the gurney, keeping it in place, keeping her body positioned as a shield between the patient and the killer. Her right shoulder went numb. Hospital security tackled the gunman within seconds. The hospital has protocols. The ICU has lockdown procedures. 3 combat-trained insurgents didn't stand a chance against security response in a trauma center. They were cuffed, subdued, secured within 45 seconds of the moment they'd breached the doors. Hannah dropped to one knee against the steel cabinet. The numbing in her shoulder was fading, replaced by a sensation like fire spreading across her ribs. Blood soaked through her scrubs, not a thin trickle, but a spreading stain that told her the shrapnel had hit deep. Her vision grayed at the edges. Medical Bay 3, someone was shouting. "Get trauma, get surgery, move, move, move." But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made the moment crystallize into something neither Hannah nor anyone in that room could ever forget. Because as they rushed her to the trauma bay, as hands grabbed her and began cutting away her scrubs to assess the damage, the colonel's eyes opened. He was conscious now, his pressure stable, his oxygen saturation climbing, his heartbeat steady on the monitor. He locked eyes with Hannah as they wheeled her past him. And his voice, weak but absolutely clear, cut through all the chaos: "Senior Chief." It was just 2 words. Just 2 words spoken by a colonel who'd seen enough combat to recognize the hand placement of someone who'd trained under fire, to understand the physiology of someone who could perform emergency pericardiocentesis with a needle at 45 degrees while moving faster than trained physicians. Dr. Sterling heard it. He was standing in the center of the ICU, his white coat spotless, his authority momentarily reasserted by the chaos and violence that he'd had nothing to do with, and he heard those 2 words shift something fundamental. He watched Hannah's eyes meet the colonel's for half a second, long enough to confirm something he'd only suspected, long enough for the recognition to flash between 2 military minds. Then Hannah's face went blank. She returned to silence, to the performance she'd perfected, but it was too late. The door was already open. The secret was already visible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. Dr. Sterling's expression shifted. The rage drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. He had what he needed. The monitor alarmed at 0320 hours. 3 short bleats that made Hannah's head snap up from the medication cart where she'd been restocking syringes. She knew that sound. Muffled heart sounds. Hypertension sinking fast. The colonel's chest rose and fell, but something inside him was filling with blood. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium, that thin sac around the heart, had accumulated enough fluid to compress the organ itself. Each beat was struggling against pressure it couldn't overcome. Without intervention in the next 90 seconds, the colonel would code. Hannah was moving before her conscious mind finished the diagnosis. Her feet knew the path. Her hands knew what came next. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the bedside, staring at the monitor as if looking harder would change the numbers climbing upward, blood pressure dropping like a stone through dark water, oxygen saturation already sliding. "Get me a 14-gauge needle." "Now," Hannah said to the resident, who scrambled toward the supply cabinet. Her voice carried the kind of certainty that made people move without question. Sterling's face twisted. We need to call cardiothoracic, get him to the OR. He won't survive transport." Hannah was already prepping the colonel's chest with antiseptic, her movements precise as a liturgy. The orange iodine spread across his ribs in careful arcs. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. "Needle goes in here." She marked the spot with her gloved finger. Between the ribs. Through the chest wall. Into the pericardium. The resident handed her the needle. Long, thin. Gleaming under the surgical lights like a surgical instrument, which it was. Hannah's left hand steadied the colonel's chest while her right positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle. She could feel Sterling's eyes on her, confused and furious, and something else, something that looked like recognition of a competence he couldn't diminish. She didn't hesitate. The needle slid in with a soft resistance, parting muscle and fascia, and then the hiss. A single perfect exhalation of air escaping the pericardium as accumulated blood and fluid decompressed. That sound was salvation. That sound was the difference between a beating heart and a flat line. The monitor responded instantly. Blood pressure climbed, 70/40, then 85/52, then 95/60. O2 sat jumped. The colonel's breathing deepened. Color returned to his face like a photograph developing in solution. 58 seconds from alarm to intervention. Hannah had done it in 90. She stepped back, still holding the needle in place with perfect steadiness, and waited for the attending to arrive and take over. When he did, when he saw what had been accomplished, when he read her vital signs and understood that this nurse had just saved a man's life with a procedure he didn't teach in his residency, he nodded once. No other questions. Sterling's jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle working. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The ICU doors exploded inward at 0326 hours. They came through like a breach team, moving with lethal purpose, for men in dark tactical gear, faces covered, rifles raised. The lead operator shouted something in Arabic that Hannah's body understood before her mind translated it. They were looking for someone. They'd found him. The colonel. Tracked from Baghdad. Protected by federal agents who were stationed in the hallway, who should have been watching, who were now engaged in gunfire outside the unit with these men who'd come to finish what they'd started overseas. Hannah's hands moved on their own. No decision. No hesitation. Just muscle memory older than her choice to be a nurse, older than her choice to walk away from the uniform. Her body knew what to do when someone tried to kill her patient. She grabbed the colonel's gurney, heavy, resistant, real, and shoved it toward the steel medical cabinet in the corner of the room. 800 pounds of equipment and conscious man, and she moved it like it weighed nothing, because relative to what her body had moved before, it didn't. The colonel's eyes locked onto hers for 1 second of pure understanding. "Stay behind the cabinet," she said. Not a request. An order. The gunfire started. Not theatrical, not the exaggerated cracks of movies. Precise. Professional. The sound of people trained to kill doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. Rounds punched through drywall. Shattered the monitor. Tore through the four stands and the medication cart with the sound of metal screaming. Hannah stood in front of the cabinet. Between the gunfire and the colonel. Between the men with rifles and the man she'd just saved. Her body became a shield, and every cell in that body understood what that meant. The shrapnel came sideways, a round fragmenting against the steel cabinet, exploding into a spray of metal shards that tore across her right shoulder like a scalpel with no mercy. Another caught her ribs, 2 inches below the cabinet's edge, hot and burning. She felt her own blood, warm and sticky, spreading across her skin. Felt her uniform tear. Felt the impact like a punch from someone's fist made of broken glass. She didn't scream. Didn't move. Didn't give the men with rifles anything except the image of someone already deciding to die where she stood. Her left hand was on the colonel's shoulder, keeping him down, keeping him behind the cabinet, keeping him alive. Security was responding now. She could hear boots in the corridor, could hear the yelling, could hear the tactical team engaging these men who'd breached their hospital. The gunfire was slowing. Ending. The threat was being neutralized. Hannah dropped to one knee, but nothing in her posture suggested pain or panic. Just transition to a lower position. A more stable position. A position that was still between her patient and danger. The colonel tried to move. "No, Senior Chief, you're hit. Stay down, sir." Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. "Don't move until they clear the room." The last shots echoed somewhere in the hospital. Then silence. Real silence, the kind that comes after violence has finished. Hannah's breathing was controlled. Her hand was steady. The blood spreading across her ribs and shoulder was real, but so was her composure, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing you might survive this too. The tactical team cleared the ICU in 90 seconds. 4 insurgents neutralized. 2 federal agents down but breathing. The colonel secure. Hannah bleeding but vertical, still protecting, still refusing medical attention until her patient had been evaluated. It was 0330 hours when the attending finally forced her to the ER bed for wound assessment. 16 stitches in her shoulder. 12 in her ribs. No arterial damage. No organ involvement. She'd been lucky, the ER doctor kept saying, as if luck had anything to do with knowing exactly where to position your body to protect another human being while bullets tore through the room. But Dr. Sterling wasn't thinking about luck. He was standing in the hallway, phone already pressed to his ear, his face arranged into an expression of deep concern. He'd heard the colonel say it. Heard those words that changed everything. Senior Chief. Combat medic. Hand placement. The truth was out there now, floating in the air like shrapnel, and Dr. Sterling had learned to weaponize truth better than most people could weaponize lies. The ER doors swung inward with the antiseptic rush of pressurized air, and Dr. Sterling was already on his phone before Hannah's stretcher cleared the trauma bay. 16 stitches in her shoulder. 12 in her ribs. The shrapnel had torn through her scrubs like they were tissue paper, and the bandages wrapped around her torso were already spotted with seeping blood. She lay still, eyes forward, breathing measured as the resident finished closing the last wound. Sterling's voice carried across the bay, calm and clinical, each word a calculated instrument. "Yes, this is Dr. Edward Sterling at Oak Creek Memorial. Board chair speaking." He moved into the hallway, and Hannah heard him, the way she always heard everything now, muscle memory from a life she'd never mentioned. "We have a situation. A staff member, nurse, civilian credentials, just endangered a critical patient and created a security incident that resulted in gunfire inside this hospital." The lie moved through the phone line with the fluidity of something rehearsed, though he hadn't rehearsed it. Sterling had been building this narrative since the moment he heard the colonel call her Senior Chief. The words came fast now, each one sharpening the blade. She has a violent history. Hidden background. We're talking about someone with undisclosed military involvement who just physically intervened in a way that, well, let's just say the ethics are questionable at best. I'm concerned about our liability here. Hannah didn't move. The resident taping the final bandage didn't look up. Sterling's phone call became 3 phone calls, then 4. Board members picking up at 0400 hours because when the chief of surgery calls, you answer. By the time the attending physician finished documenting her injuries and discharged her from the ER, Sterling had already contacted the state nursing board, cited falsified employment history, she never disclosed military service, which was technically true and legally damning, and submitted a formal complaint alleging unauthorized procedures and patient endangerment. He'd crafted his story with the precision of someone who understood institutional power. The narrative wasn't that Hannah had saved the colonel's life. The narrative was that a nurse with concealed military background had created an unsafe situation, hadn't disclosed critical information during hiring, and had taken unauthorized action during a crisis. Dangerous. Liability. Red flags. Hannah sat in the hospital lobby at 0520 hours wearing borrowed scrubs, her own still catalogued as evidence from the shooting, and watched as her life disassembled itself with bureaucratic efficiency. A hospital administrator she'd never met approached holding a manila folder. Your credentialing has been suspended pending investigation. We've secured your locker. Your access badge is deactivated. The woman's voice was apologetic but firm, the tone of someone following protocol, not making choices. Hannah accepted the folder without opening it. She already knew what it contained. Your name has been flagged in the state nursing database as of 0407 hours this morning. Falsified employment records. That's a licensing issue, not just a hospital issue. The administrator waited for a response. Hannah gave none. Dr. Sterling's documentation is quite thorough. Of course it was. Sterling had spent for hours on the phone with people who owed him favors, board members who benefited from his tenure, colleagues who feared his influence. He'd painted a picture of a nurse too dangerous to trust, too deceptive to keep, too much of a liability to defend. The administrator left. Hannah sat in the lobby as the sun began to rise over Raleigh, painting the glass doors amber and gold, and felt the weight of 7 years of silence finally reaching critical mass. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. The doors burst open at 0847 hours, and the sound of boots on tile echoed through the lobby like a countdown. For Delta Force operators in full tactical kit, plate carriers, sidearms, the precise bearing of men accustomed to moving through hostile territory. Behind them, the colonel, moving slower than he had 12 hours ago but moving, his jaw set with the kind of fury that comes from understanding exactly what was happening. And beside him, a woman in marine dress blues, insignia sharp as broken glass, who moved like she'd inherited the colonel's rage and honed it into something more dangerous. The colonel's voice carried through the lobby with the weight of command. "Where is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke?" The administrator, who had been walking back toward her office, stopped dead. The receptionist looked up from her station. Every head in the waiting room turned. Hannah stood. The Marine captain, daughter, the name tag read Monroe, saw her first, and her eyes went bright with recognition and something that looked like righteous anger. She covered the distance in 12 strides. "My father says you took shrapnel defending him." The captain's voice was loud enough to echo. "Says you're the reason he's still breathing. Says you've got 2 silver stars and a Navy Cross from Baghdad." The words fell like charges being read. 2 silver stars. A veteran sitting 3 rows back straightened. And a Navy Cross. Another veteran stood. The receptionist's hand went to her mouth. Sterling, who had been in his office on the 2nd floor reviewing notes for a meeting, heard the commotion. He came downstairs because he always came downstairs when attention was being paid, when narratives were being shaped. He arrived just in time to see what he'd unleashed. The SEAL team leader, call sign Breach, chest full of ribbons that made Sterling's decorations look like participation trophies, stepped forward with a folder in his hands. Senior Chief Clarke served 3 combat deployments. 3. She ran trauma response for Joint Special Operations Command. Baghdad, Helmand, Cunha Province. Each location landed like a hammer strike. She holds awards most people don't even know exist. Awards for saving lives under fire. She's the most decorated hospital corpsman in recent operational history. The folder was open now, pages that should have been classified, military record that should have been sealed, all of it suddenly public and irrefutable. Sterling's face had gone the color of old snow. The colonel moved toward him, and one of the operators, a massive man with scar tissue around his eyes, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Not to stop him. To give him permission to continue. You tried to destroy her career, the colonel said quietly, which was worse than shouting. You called her a liar. Called her dangerous. I watched her take shrapnel that was meant for me. Sterling opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That's when the FBI agent stepped forward, older woman, navy suit, the kind of calm that comes from having seen institutional corruption before and always watching for it. Dr. Sterling, we're investigating several federal crimes. Access to classified military personnel records. Attempted alteration of sealed documents this morning. We have keystroke logs. She pulled out her phone, showed him the screen. His username. His terminal. 03 for 7 hours. The timestamp of his attempt to access Hannah's service record and flag it as fraudulent. That's a federal crime, Doctor. 10 years minimum. The sound of handcuffs was quiet in the lobby, barely audible over the fluorescent light's thin electrical hum. Just a click, a metallic whisper, the sound of someone's world ending. Sterling's wrists were small, Hannah had never noticed that before, thin-boned and white. The officer reading his rights moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Sterling tried to speak again, tried to launch into an explanation, but the SEAL team leader stepped into his line of sight. She ran 7 trauma surgeries in 72 hours in Baghdad with no power, no running water, and mortar fire outside the operating tent. She saved 43 lives doing it. 43. The operator's voice was conversational, almost gentle. You couldn't save one patient's career because you were too small. They walked Sterling toward the doors, hands cuffed, and that's when the waiting room full of veterans, 12 of them, all waiting for appointments, all having heard the commotion, stood up as one and snapped to attention. Not for Sterling. For Hannah. Feet together, spine straight, the ancient acknowledgement of honor rendered and respect earned, the kind of salute that civilians never quite understood but soldiers never forgot. Hannah stood motionless, her shoulders straight despite the stitches beneath her borrowed scrubs, despite the pain that radiated like electricity across her ribs and shoulder. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She did what she'd always done, she stood at attention and acknowledged the honor with a single nod that carried more weight than 1,000 words could have. The SEAL team leader approached her, the folder still in his hands. Your clearance was never revoked, he said quietly, so only she could hear. You left because the nightmares were too loud, not because you stopped being senior chief. That doesn't just go away. Hannah took the folder. Inside was everything, service record, commendations, the full architecture of a life she'd spent 7 years pretending didn't exist. The hospital administrator appeared at the edge of the gathering, caught between protocols and the reality unfolding in front of her. The SEAL commander, his call sign was Holloway, chest full of medals that made him look like a monument to violence rendered necessary, turned to her. Senior Chief Clarke is officially reinstated to her position at Oak Creek Memorial, effective immediately, with full back pay and administrative leave for medical recovery. We'll be facilitating that through proper channels. It wasn't a request. The administrator nodded. What else could she do? By noon, Dr. Sterling's office was being cleared by hospital security. His parking space was reassigned by 1400 hours. His credentials were being forwarded to the medical board for review under the category Gross Ethical Violations and Criminal Conduct. His wife would leave him by Thursday. His lawyer would tell him the federal case was essentially unwinnable by Friday. Within 18 hours, Sterling had ceased to exist in any meaningful professional capacity. But that was later. In this moment, in the Oak Creek Memorial lobby as the morning light strengthened and the story spread through text messages and hallway whispers and the kind of institutional memory that never forgets, Hannah Clarke stood steady despite her wounds and accepted the return of an identity she'd tried to bury. The colonel's daughter embraced her carefully, mindful of the stitches. The veteran patients filed past her, each one saying the same thing, "Thank you for your service, Senior Chief." And Hannah, still finding her voice in this new configuration of truth, said the only thing that mattered, "Thank you for yours." She would return to Oak Creek Memorial 6 months later, not as a suspended nurse but as director of a new combat trauma integration program, with authority and budget and the kind of institutional backing that comes from being right when it mattered most. She would train residents in techniques learned under fire. She would publish papers on pre-hospital response. She would hold her military rank not as a secret but as a credential. But first, she went home, unwrapped her shoulder carefully, and looked at the shrapnel scars in the mirror, pink, raised, permanent, and thought about the invisible one she'd finally put down. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your entire story, subscribe to see what happens when the truth finally surfaces. What would you have done in Hannah's position? Like and comment below.